In Westbridge, every notification carries a story. A simple message can change a life. And sometimes, love begins beyond the screen. Ping. A slim rectangle of light on a phone screen in the dark. Westbridge vets and families. One new message. Night in the city had that pooled quiet that made everything feel sharper. People fell asleep to the hum of trains and the distant foghorns. They woke to the glare of deadlines. On the server, the messages didn't care about bedtime. Anyone know where to find help for a veteran's family? The post read, Anonymous, the kind of query that could be the beginning of a dozen small kindnesses or nothing at all. Olivia Bennett saw it at 2:17 a.m. because her insomnia came with a landlord's list of worries, a foundation audit scheduled for next month, a board meeting to steer, a fundraising gala with tables that still needed donors. She watched the question float in the channel and felt the old, familiar ache. She had started the Bennett Foundation to be the answer to that exact kind of query. She had built an organization out of grief, out of the hole her brother left when he stepped out of his own life. The charity was her attempt to leave something better for people who walked where he had faltered. She hovered over the keyboard and almost typed the organization's contact, the helpline, the polished page they spent nights polishing. Instead, she opened a new DM. It felt safer to be small with a stranger than to step into the public square again. Grey Maple is typing. Grey Maple. Hi. I don't have much, just time. Who are you trying to reach? She didn't put her name, she didn't put titles. The anonymity was deliberate. Easier to be honest that way. Replies came back with the cautious grammar of people who wrote support posts at odd hours. Someone else offered a link to a low-cost counseling clinic. Someone else recommended a parent support group meeting on Saturdays. Grey Maple kept the thread alive with practical questions: age of the child, immediate needs, whether the family could get to Westbridge's community centre. No one would have guessed Grey Maple was Olivia Bennett, someone whose face had been on a magazine once with a neat headline. Founder, daughter of a general, the woman who turned grief into grants. Online, she could be a voice that listened. 2 servers over, in a split-shift life of weight plates and early breakfasts, Jackson Reed saw the same post by chance. He'd been cleaning up after an evening class at Ironclad Fitness, wiping down mats, arranging dumbbells the way a man used to organizing equipment on a boat arranges lines. Single father, ex-Special Forces, 28 years old out of his skin with the responsibility for a small person who loved glitter and soups and the exact geometry of pancakes. His username was Rook. He used Rook because in chess, a rook moved forward and guarded. It sounded right to the man who had learned to set up shields where none existed. Rook. I can help with rides to the clinic if you're nearby. I'm in Westbridge. Kids are welcome at my gym after hours. He offered simple things: gas money, childcare on Saturdays, while a mother processed paperwork, an extra coat if the winter had bitten hard. On Discord, you could measure people by their patience. He answered questions plainly: age, school, any immediate needs. He asked whether the family had heard from the foundation already. Olivia, still in pajamas in an apartment that smelled faintly of old coffee and laundry detergent, found herself grateful for the bluntness. She typed faster than she expected. Grey Maple. Thank you. The family's in East Vale. The mother tried calling the foundation helpline and nothing. I'll DM you details. Please don't post them publicly. There was a pause, the length of a breath, then a small string of emojis, an honest attempt at softness, and a phone number. They began with logistics and quickly moved into the ordinary exchanges that made people human to each other. Recipes for picky eaters. The best clinic in a neighborhood that most people only visited at rush hour. A simple list of what to bring to an intake appointment. They traded links for therapists and the names of teachers that remembered names. Then, because humans don't stay in the purely practical for long, they drifted toward the smaller things. What to read during a drive across a city and the secret of folding a fitted sheet without cursing. It lasted at first as all small courtesies last in the low light. Polite, useful and contained. But the weeks made a softer arc. When the foundation's PR team drafted statements in the light of rumors that would become headlines if she didn't act. Olivia typed in her quiet hours about the loneliness of fundraising calls and board members who could smell weakness like predatory animals. Rook replied with short, exact lines about training regimens and the comforting repetition of mornings that began with a kettlebell and a coffee mug close to a child's sticky hand. He would sometimes send a picture of a small boy with a missing tooth eating cereal with a triumphant milk mustache. Lily's grin was a daylight that punched through whatever private fog she carried. They were strangers who learned the cadence of each other's loneliness. She never asked him for his last name. He never volunteered the rank on his uniform that used to get him noticed in different rooms. They traded no photos, only the occasional emoji-flung courage. It was, for both of them, a new kind of practice, trusted enough to speak without consequence, anonymous enough that shame had no foothold. On a Thursday in early October, the Discord server was a hum of discussions about a community garden and a late-night request for mentorship programs. Olivia saw a news alert blink across the bottom of her phone. Westbridge Foundation under preliminary review, local sources say. Her stomach folded. She texted a terse message to her lawyer first, closed the screen, and then, with a steadier hand than she felt, typed into the server. Grey Maple. Has anyone had experience with audits? What steps help preserve donors' trust in a very public moment? Rook answered immediately, in the almost impatient tone of someone who liked to solve things before they became problems. Transparency. Tell what you know. Tell what you don't. Don't guess. Protect what's delicate. People first, numbers later. That phrase, protect what's delicate, cracked something open inside her. She had been raised on the soldierly aphorisms of her father, General Bennett, who liked maxims that smelled of order and discipline. But this was not about rank. It was about the fragile intimacy of people who leaned on a system that could fail them. She typed back. She admitted, in a single line, that she feared for the families who relied on the programs that fed and guided veterans and their children. Rook answered with a simple human acknowledgement. We'll help where we can. Neither of them believed, in those late exchanges, that they were building anything like friendship. But they were both surprised when a connection began to feel like a small promise. The night the connection went from quiet to visible started, oddly, at a mall. There's a wrong myth about heroics, that they are cinematic decisions made in slow motion. They are not. They are small, brutally practical actions that look like reflex to anyone who is trained for a single purpose. Do one thing at a time, and do it without thinking too hard. Jackson had not intended to be a hero that afternoon. He took a break between a weekday afternoon seminar for young dads and an early morning class at Ironclad to pick up replacement tape for a jump rope. And then, because his daughter liked the mechanical owl in the toy store, he let her choose a tiny plushie. He had hair in the wrong places after a hurried shave, a gym tee that smelled faintly of sweat, and a pair of earbuds in his ears that buzzed with a playlist meant to keep him upright through the grey hours. Lily held his hand, her navy blue scarf looped clumsily around her neck, her particular addiction to anything that smelled of Sarah, Jackson's late wife, who had loved deep navy like a horizon. The scarf had been Sarah's. Sarah had stitched a small constellation of stars on one corner of it, before the world closed around them. Lily fancied herself the guardian of those stars. They moved through the mall like everyone else. Half a step, half a glance. The flow of a busy Saturday. Olivia and her assistant, a woman named Rachel with a voicemail of nerves stabilized by caffeine, moved through the same space, clutching a small tote of donation forms. They had decided to visit a pop-up community outreach table, manned by student volunteers, to keep the foundation visible and to remind people that, underneath the PR smears, there were families whose lives depended on food and counselling and childcare. A cluster of cameras folded into a swarm near a storefront. Flashes rolled like small explosions. A reporter's voice boomed something into a microphone. The public glare had a smell, stale perfume, and the metallic twinge of adrenaline. Olivia kept moving, because not moving would have been a spectacle in itself. She kept her head down, the way you carry a paper bundle too close to the chest. "Excuse me," a voice demanded, sharp, invasive. "Ms. Bennett, did you know about the missing funds? Our family's losing services because of your oversight." Words were arrows. Olivia's hands went cold. Lily, who had been trailing behind clutching her plush owl, hesitated. A shutter clicked too close. Someone shouted. The crowd smelled like hot coffee and the enamel of new shoes. Cameras angled for the face that had once given speeches about building better systems. Olivia's face, now an image to be mined for outrage. It was then Jackson moved. He had been watching from the edge, a father's instinct making him drift closer without deciding. One camera swung their way and clipped Lily with a blast of light. People, in the second before decisions are made, perform small moral arithmetic. Step closer or step away, shield or stare. Jackson stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not make a speech. He positioned his body between the cameras and the small person whose scarf fluttered like a banner of private history. He placed his hand gently on Olivia's shoulder, one palm on fabric, the other steadying Lily's elbow, and guided them away. The press made a new picture, a woman flanked by a man whose face none of them had time to place. The camera would pick up the gesture and not the context. Olivia felt the press heat on the back of her neck and the gentle authority of a solid person at her side. There was, for a breath, a recall of a discord exchange. Protect what's delicate, like an echo. She saw, in Jackson's set jaw and the careful way he watched the crowd, the same practical cadence she'd come to appreciate in Rook's late messages. "You can stay behind us," he said, low enough that only she and Lily could hear. His voice was a worn instrument, somewhere between instruction and comfort. She did not hand him her business card. She didn't need to. Instead, she gave him the small, human thing that meant she trusted someone enough to accept help. She let Lily loop her fingers through his. Lily, who treated adult kindness as a currency she would redeem later with drawings and small confessions, looked up at him with the gravity of a child offering thanks. They parted without ceremony. The news cycle churned, but the image followed them in ways that confounded both of them. On the server the next day, someone shared a grainy clip of the encounter. Eyes traced the frame, the protective man, the child with the navy scarf, the woman who attempted to fold grief into public service. Rook posted a single line under the clip. "Are they okay?" Grey Maple replied, "Yes, thank you." The bridge between online and real life built itself from gestures that cannot be scheduled. Later that week, Olivia found a small envelope tucked beneath the counter at Ironclad Fitness. She had stopped by to speak with the gym's manager about offering a sliding scale fitness class for veterans' spouses, an idea born in a forum thread, now creeping toward implementation. She hadn't told anyone she might be coming. Inside the envelope was a neatly completed scholarship application, a child's name, a parent's statement, signatures where needed. The paper was folded with the exact kind of care someone uses when placing a secret offering on a neighbor's porch. A brief pause in the story. Be honest. Have you ever met someone online who changed your life? Tell your story in the comments. Back to the story. Her first impulse was to scan the room for a prank. The gym smelled of rubber and sweat, and the faint sweet residue of protein shakes. The application had been slid beneath the counter as if by a considerate courier. On the bottom, in a handwriting that had the straightness of military training, someone had scrawled a single line. "Protect what matters most." Olivia sat on the bench and laughed when she realized she was crying. The sound was brittle and it startled her. She ran a thumb along the crease of the paper and then, with an economy of motion she rarely allowed herself, she wrote a short note and tucked it back into the envelope as if to keep the conversation alive. "Thank you," she wrote. "We'll take care of this." She looked up, and for the first time, Rook and Grey Maple collapsed into the same human body. The grandfather clock in the lobby ticked. A man, who had been lifting weights with the frenetic attention of someone trying to outrun memory, raised his head and offered a nod the shape of an invitation. It was Jackson, of course, a little more worn than his online presence suggested, but with the same practical steadiness. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, the strange and intimate thing that happens when voices become faces. The gym's manager, who had a temper that could double as curiosity, cleared his throat and asked, in the tone of someone holding a mild scandal at bay, whether Olivia wanted to talk in the office. She did. The door closed softly behind them. They spoke about programs, about scheduling, about liability, and the faint, thick scent of bureaucracy that clung to all good intentions. Jackson listened like a man who liked lists, who liked to convert ideas into checkboxes. He made small suggestions: child-friendly equipment in the back room, a volunteer roster for weekend childcare, and his suggestions were more practical than grandiose. Olivia, who had grown accustomed to people promising the moon and handing her a broom, found the simplicity of his answers steadying. Outside of the meeting, Lily had already decided that Olivia was someone who might bake cookies and read books in a voice that made characters come alive. She pressed a drawing into Olivia's palm, an enormous blue scarf embroidered with stars, and 3 stick figures with exaggerated smiles. Olivia wrapped the drawing around the scholarship application and kept it in her bag like a talisman. There are small economies of trust in places like Westbridge. It is a city where people learn to trade favors like currency. One time watching a child, another time offering a room for a mother in need. Trust doesn't build in a speech. It accrues in 1,000 minute transactions. A message at 2 a.m., a solid hand at a crowded mall, a scholarship placed beneath a counter. After the meeting, Olivia messaged Rook. "Thank you." She offered a time and a vague invitation to talk logistics if he wanted to be more involved. The thread hummed with the ordinary vibrations of a community. He replied with a brief list of availabilities and one offhand offer. "I can run a free Saturday morning class, kettlebells, basic movement and child-friendly activities in the back." She accepted because she wanted to be practical and because she was, privately, drawn to people who kept their promises. She did not think of romance or of headlines that might read like the beginning of a novel. She thought emphatically of the families who might get a counseling session because someone showed up on a Saturday and taught a dad how to carry a baby while doing a deadlift without his knee hating him. A soft CTA. If you're drawn to character-led stories about trust and second chances, stay with us. The line, quiet and unobtrusive, was more a promise to the reader than a prompt. It felt like the same kind of soft arrangement Olivia and Jackson were making, a request to remain present for the slow work of repair. The first Saturday class was a modest success. The gym's backroom smelled of baby shampoo and hardwood polish. Parents arrived with sneakers and small apologies. Jackson taught the movement slowly, with the discipline of someone who had taught others to breathe when the world pitched sideways. Olivia arranged cots and colouring books and paperwork for the intake table with the tiny, precise control of a person who preferred lists to feelings. Lily, of course, attached herself to the most interesting corner, a stack of foam blocks that could be remodelled into fortresses and small planets. In the pauses between sets, people told each other the small stories that make neighbourhoods: where to get a used stroller, which teacher took an extra minute after school, who would watch a child if someone had to go to court. Olivia listened more than she spoke. She watched Jackson calibrate his tone for an audience that included toddlers and veterans who had never said aloud some of the uglier things they'd seen. He never patronized. He never used his past as a bludgeon of credibility. He offered steps and practice. The afternoons began to pile into a soft rebuilding of rhythm. Olivia made it a habit to send Lily a paper note in her lunchbox when the child came to an event. They developed the code of people who could say more with less. Lily's notes were simple: star stickers, a hastily drawn sun, a smudged heart. The navy scarf became a talisman, wrapping around Lily's neck like a quiet promise. Jackson, who taught early classes and closed with a gentle round of "see you tomorrows," learned the exact way Olivia held her pen when making lists, and could tell, after a silent hour, when she was about to snap at a volunteer. There were, in the small world they stitched, brief, luminous confessions. Olivia told Jackson the origin story she carried like an ache, how the foundation had started after her brother, Marcus, had taken his life in a hotel room no family had imagined he would enter. She said it once, in a sentence that left no room for reclaiming the past. The confession was not theatrical. It was a fact she offered because, in the honest office of the gym, there was no defense worth keeping up. Jackson replied, eventually, in the sort of understatement that carried weight. I lost someone too. My wife. Car accident. It wasn't a long explanation. For both of them, the names carried a gravity. In both cases, the lost loved one was a constellation around which private grief orbited. They kept those names like small, delicate instruments, used sparingly, struck when necessary. Lily, who listened with the economy of children, offered detail nobody else thought to mention. My mum used to say the stars are first when it's lonely, she told Olivia one afternoon, feet swinging, her scarf askew. She sewed them on so she could see them at night. I tell them secrets. Olivia made a place in her chest, warm with a tenderness she had rationed since Marcus's funeral. She began to think of small acts, a reading corner stocked with simple paperbacks, a letter-writing session where parents and kids could write notes to lost people without needing to speak into the wind. As the weeks arranged themselves into months, the foundation's work and the gym's stable routines overlapped. Olivia began to visit the Saturday classes, not as a founder giving applause, but as someone checking in, listening to intake forms, signing scholarship slips, learning the names of children she had only seen in social media blurbs. Jackson took to adding the exact details of families into a loose ledger he kept near the back. Birth dates, allergies, favorite cartoons. He treated the ledger like training notes. He also learned the rhythm of Olivia's anxiety, how her jaw tightened when she received an email from a donor, how her hands fumbled when a reporter called. He began, very precisely, to offer small acts of containment, bringing her a coffee on late nights, leaving a single blank sheet of paper with the words, "Protect what matters most," written on the top, so she had a place to list the urgent tasks without letting them gnaw at her sleep. They shared rituals that were not romantic so much as domestic. Pancakes on Sundays for Lily, with blueberries arranged like planets. A note folded into Olivia's bag that read, "See you at the gala," in handwriting that suggested more than mere engagement. A borrowed funeral suit Jackson left at his mother's, with a careful request that it be pressed for an event that had no immediate plan. The suit was an act of propriety. He kept it ready because sometimes proper armor made the world tolerable. But the timeline of their quiet repair moved alongside other clocks. The Foundation's board called a meeting. An audit letter arrived with the procedural chill of legalese. The rumour mill spun faster when a local blogger sniffed the scent of scandal. Olivia answered emails with the same economy she used to answer difficult people at conferences. Short, measured, legally minded. She slept in short fragments, and in them dreamt of numbers that slid like fish across a ledger. On a soft Thursday evening, while the gym simmered down and Lily lay cradled like an animal under a blanket in the back reading a book about constellations, Olivia found a journal on a bench near the entrance. It was bound in worn leather, and she recognized the careful scrawl on the inside, Lily's handwriting, looping and earnest. She flipped through the pages and saw sketches of stars, names of friends, and an entry that made her pause. "We met a man who taught me how to stand like a soldier without being mean," Lily had written in letters that leaned toward the margins. "He helped me when the bright lights hurt. He said to protect the stars. I like him. He has a sad smile like my dad." The entry was short and full of child logic, and it wormed into Olivia like sunlight under a door. She thought of Marcus and of Sarah, and of the small ways people survived. She thought of the way strangers accorded one another gentleness when they were anonymous, and the different, harder work of giving that gentleness a face. That night, after Lily slept and the gym lights dimmed to a soft amber, Jackson sat alone with his own notes. He rubbed his palms, calloused in the exact places that told of a life spent hauling, lifting, protecting. He thought of the messages on Discord, the late-night offers of help, the small kindnesses that had made the server feel like a room where people did not judge. He had never planned to be anything other than a man with a schedule and a child to raise. The DM had been a place to give assistance without strings. Now there were strings, the paper left at the counter, the nods exchanged across benches, the small, unplanned intimacy of someone knowing the cadence of your worry. In the quiet, they cultivated a kitchen counter, a gym floor, a child's sun-drawn scarf. Two strangers moved, with care, towards something that looked like trust. It was slow, and it was improvisational. It required both of them to keep showing up when showing up cost them something. On a rain-slick morning, a headline scrolled across Olivia's phone like a prophecy. Westbridge Foundation under preliminary review. Local sources say the language was careful and false in its economy. She felt the news like pressure, small and steady and piercing. She thought of families who would read the headline and immediately think, services cut, my child hungry. She typed a statement because that was the work she did. Measured words that promised transparency and care. She typed it and then closed the app and tried to breathe. Jackson received the same headline on his feed at the gym while students tried a new circuit. He watched the room for a moment to see whether anyone recognized the story's gravity. A man near the back looked up, eyes raw with something like bankruptcy of hope. Jackson had been trained to see the small things people tried to hide. He had also been trained to fix what he could and to inventory what could not be fixed. He logged the lead of an incoming volunteer who could help with outreach and sent Olivia a short message. If you need backup on a community statement, I can help get families to sign a supportive declaration of needs. He meant what he wrote, but also he felt the tug of something else. The real human ache that comes when you see a system that keeps people afloat begin to fray. They kept their work practical. Olivia returned signed forms. Jackson organized volunteer schedules. Lily kept sewing star constellations onto the inside of her scarf in secret, confident that stitches could make memory visible and safe. The parting between the world's gaze and the small rooms where people rebuild had not yet occurred. There were press flashes and there were kind notes. There were simple acts of care, a scholarship folded under a counter, a kettlebell class that taught a father how to squat without fear, a note in a lunchbox that said, "See you at the gala," with a smiley face. Trust for now looked like competence and the steady habit of showing up. But in a city that listened for scandal like a dog to a bell, small kindnesses can become headlines, and the bridge between anonymity and public life can bend under burdens neither party anticipates. Olivia folded the scholarship application into the small pocket of her bag, and for the first time in weeks, let herself believe that the foundation might keep breathing. Outside, the rain softened into a drizzle. Lily, a small planet of warmth under the gym lights, slid her navy scarf higher around her neck and traced the embroidered stars. She hummed a tune she had invented about guards and constellations and men who taught you how to lift a box without breaking. Some promises are made out loud. Others, like the ones Grey Maple and Rook were making in the quiet of servers and bench rooms, were inked in the thin hours and kept like secret instructions. The next morning, the city would wake and the gossip would begin its slow orbit. For now, the immediate work, schedules, class lists, a list of names of children who needed a place to be safe, sat like humble armor. Each small action stacked into a scaffold that might, if they were careful, bear more weight than any single person could carry. The first act closed not with resolution, but with a ledger, partly written, a scarf that smelled of home, and two strangers who had begun the long, patient work of showing up. They started as strangers on Discord in Westbridge. They had not yet become a family. They had only begun to learn how to trust the hands that reached for them. The city outside kept talking. Inside the small rooms, and in messages exchanged at odd hours, the real work continued, holding steady, keeping lists, drawing stars. The story that would gather the city's attention had only just found its first visible thread. The weeks after the scholarship under the counter stacked into ordinary rhythms, and the world outside kept leaning toward rumor. Quiet work does not stop a city from whispering its worst stories into polite ears. An audit began with a formal letter, then a forensic firm walking through ledgers as if they were a crime scene. Olivia sat through meetings where language tightened into clauses and contingency plans. Martin Walsh, the Foundation's counsel, spoke in steady, measured sentences that contained more than legal advice, the careful cadence of someone who had seen reputations bend but not break, or break and then become history. One rainy Thursday, a junior accountant in a navy cardigan slipped into Olivia's office and left a file that smelled faintly of copier ink and cold coffee. It was a bundle of bank statements and internal transfer memos. In its center, a pattern repeated like a bruise, a series of transfers to shell accounts, payments labeled as vendor fees that went to a name the accountant said he didn't recognize. The ledger numbers folded into each other in a way that suggested deliberate obfuscation. Olivia held the paper and felt the room go very small. She thought of families who counted on a weekend meal or a counselor's sympathetic chair. She thought of Marcus, the reason she had taught herself to read budgets in the sleepless hours. She put the file on her desk and called Martin. They walked through the numbers with the restraint of people, where every misstep could be a headline. The word Harrington surfaced like a stone tossed into water and rippled. William Harrington, the ex-financial director who had handled payroll and grants for years, had signatory access. Martin's jaw tightened in ways Olivia could see when he worried. He used phrases like unexplained variance and review board. He said nothing that was not necessary. He said just enough. For reasons that were both practical and personal, the story moved outward sooner than Olivia wanted. A friend in the mayor's office pulled strings for a quick preliminary audit. The board insisted on transparency. Olivia, who had always believed in telling what she knew and acknowledging what she didn't, authorized a limited press statement. An audit had been initiated. They were cooperating. Families were a priority. She believed that measured transparency was a kind of triage. The statement landed like a paper boat in a storm of attention. It was Mike, Jackson's army buddy, now a reporter with a quieter, more investigative paper than the viral blogs, that pushed the story into public pressure. He called Jackson sometime after closing on a Saturday class. There was small talk, how Lily was, what Jackson planned for the afternoon, then a mention of clippings and a question that put folded urgency into another voice. "Have you noticed anything odd about transfers at the Foundation?" Mike asked, his tone that of someone who had learned to measure risk in sentences. Jackson did not tell Mike about ledgers or accounting jargon. He told him what he had heard from volunteers, what small gaps had looked like, checks that cleared too quickly, invoices for events that had happened in a different city. He told Mike the basic pattern and the names he had heard in half-quiet conversations. He did not forge documents. He did not pretend to be an accountant, but he offered context, the kind of human testimony a reporter could follow. Mike, who had the nose of a man who could turn rumor into a chain of verifiable facts, asked for contacts and suggested ways to protect them. He promised to be scrupulous. Jackson's choice to speak to Mike was propelled by the same impulse that made him intercept a camera at a mall, protect the vulnerable. He imagined families who, in the absence of swift revelation, might wake to closed doors and empty food boxes. He imagined Lily's straightforward sense of what care should look like and felt a pressure he could not deflect. The Tribune piece that followed had a headline crafted to bite. "Millions missing from Westbridge Foundation accounts. Where did the money go?" It appeared on a Tuesday morning and spread through the city like a fever. The article did not invent facts. It followed paper trails that Mike had dug into and records that auditors had verified. It quoted concerned donors and parents who had been on waitlists for services. It named William Harrington as a person of interest and included documents that suggested irregular transfers. When the story broke, cameras returned to Olivia with renewed appetite. Reporters called her at meals, at late hours. Donors demanded answers. Board members circled in crisis mode. Olivia felt the air around her thin and fragile, like the surface of a lake on cold mornings. She called a meeting with Martin and the remaining senior staff. The room hummed with the brittle energy of people who had to move fast without panicking. Martin, who had always valued moral clarity wrapped in legal procedure, looked at the group and said plainly, "We pursue the facts. We cooperate. We do not act on rumor." He also pressed on the one thing Olivia feared. Transparency must be paired with accountability. If Harrington had embezzled, he must be held responsible. Holding someone accountable meant getting evidence in the open and not hiding behind PR spin. Olivia nodded. It was the right thing to do legally and ethically, but she felt the soft things. Families, lunches, counsellors in trailers, like beads strung along a thread, threatened to snap. What Martin did not, and could not, control was how people outside the room would read the lines between legal caution and moral outrage. For some, the story was a simple story of villainy and victim. For others, it was an opportunity to pounce. The city, accustomed to narrative economy, wanted a face to blame. In the midst of that storm, Jackson's inbox filled with messages. Some were supportive, volunteers offering extra calendars, and a woman who said simply that she had been helped because someone showed up. Others were sharper, accusations on social media that he had gone behind Olivia's back and betrayed a trust. Someone had taken an old Discord screenshot and circled a line, "Protect what's delicate," and posted it with a caption implying that Jackson had acted like a vigilante, leaking for his own reasons. The internet, efficient in moral simplifications, wanted heroes and villains. Olivia read the Tribune piece with fingers that refused to stop. She appreciated the evidence-led approach, but she learned about Jackson's involvement not from a phone call, but from a message thread where a volunteer asked whether it was true the man who had left the scholarship at Ironclad had helped the reporter. She felt a tightening she could not disguise. Trust was not a ledger that updated linearly. It was a fragile web. She took a walk through the office like someone seeking a place to spit out anger and swallowed instead. When the board convened an emergency session, Martin expected the question that would make or break private trust. He said, "We need to know who spoke to press and why." The room waited. Olivia's voice when she answered was small and direct. Transparency required a thorough accounting. Whoever had spoken to the press had complicated our legal strategy. That complication could not be ignored. There is a difference between whistleblowing with evidence and circulating suspicion without documentation. The law and ethics make that division clear. She spoke not like a woman closing ranks, but like someone alarmed that a private channel had opened into public fire. Jackson, who had been expecting that the revelation of misconduct would prompt gratitude in some quarters and tough questions in others, did not expect the personal angle. He expected professional scrutiny. He did not expect to be called to an office where the board's faces were a mixture of hurt and hardened resolve. Olivia's eyes were steady and contained more than disappointment. They were a quiet accumulation of fear made human. "Why didn't you come to me?" she asked. Not in accusation, but in the stripped, urgent way of someone who wanted to know the mechanics of the choice. Jackson's answer was not an apology at first, but description. How he'd seen patterns. How he'd thought Mike could corroborate faster than internal processes might. How he had feared that delaying public awareness would risk families. He said plainly that his training wired him to act when hesitation endangered people. He used the word protect and meant it as both motive and defense. Olivia listened with a stillness that made the room feel brittle. She thought of the boundaries she had set between personal and professional life. Those lines had always mattered more since Marcus. She made a decision in the way a surgeon severs a tissue to prevent infection. She terminated his consulting arrangement. The word fired others into action. The board, protective of institutional integrity, supported the move. Lily, who had been picking at the hem of her scarf outside the office door, watched her father leave with a small victim of circumstance look hardened beyond her years. Children have a way of reading schedules. They translate adult chaos into small tragedies. Lily's drawing of the 3 stick figures, the scarf like a bridge, was still folded in Olivia's bag. In the hallway, Olivia stopped and pulled it out and smoothed it with thumbs that smelled faintly of copier ink. The paper's edges made a map of domestic loyalty, and the decision she'd made felt like a wedge shifting in her ribcage. Jackson left without protest. He knew the consequences of choices and had lived with the cost of many of them. He expected anger from donors and strangers. He did not expect the silence that followed. For 2 weeks, the phone calls that once looped cheerful volunteers into his schedule slowed until they were barely there. Lily, who had once practiced the names of other children at the gym like small talismans, began to ask fewer questions. She drew smaller stars. During the quiet, Jackson replayed the chain of responsibility that had led him to Mike. He thought of the nights he had read online about families who said their support checks had bounced. He thought of the ledger line that the junior accountant had slipped into Olivia's office. He thought of a system that sometimes moved like a glacier while families needed a bridge. He told himself he had acted to make the bridge visible, yet actions have costs. Mike's exposé had spurred an investigation that ultimately led to criminal charges against Harrington. Harrington was arrested after bank subpoenas turned up transfers to an account tied to a shell corporation in another state. The legal process moved forward with a pace that combined months and meticulous evidence gathering. Olivia oversaw restitution conversations and board reforms. In Martin's legal briefings, Olivia heard the language of accountability and felt a hard comfort. Finally, it seemed, there might be a path to holding a wrongdoer to account. But the legal process did little to soothe the personal rupture between her and Jackson. At the courthouse, a subpoena arrived addressed to Jackson. The piece of paper felt to him heavier than the discipline that had laced into his muscles. He had to appear and speak under oath about what he had known and when he had known it. He had to explain why he had contacted a reporter before the Foundation's internal mechanisms had completed their own review. He had to stand before people whose job was to differentiate motive from law. The deposition room smelled of paper and coffee. Jackson sat across from Martin, who now wore a different hat. Not counsel, but adversary in a narrow procedural sense. Martin's questions were precise, like a man disassembling a clock to understand which gear had been misapplied. Jackson answered with straightness. He explained his chain of observations, the odd vendor names, the invoices that didn't match events, the sense volunteers had described when checks arrived late. He said he had contacted Mike because he feared immediate harm to families. There were legal complications to everything he said. Martin cross-examined carefully. The record would show Jackson had not accessed private financial systems. He had not forged documents. But the record would also show that he had spoken publicly about concerns before the internal audit reached a conclusion. The line between whistleblowing and rumor had been blurred by speed and urgency. In the deposition, Jackson was forced to place himself within that ambiguity, to confess that his instincts had outrun the process. He said, "I wanted to stop harm, not start chaos." It was both confession and defense. When the deposition ended, the judge's clerk stamped the papers with a bureaucratic thud that sounded like closure and like something else entirely. Harrington was indicted. The prosecution argued that documents showed a pattern. The city watched as legal processes unfolded. Some praised the revelation. Others chastised the method. Jackson faced criticism and support in equal measure. During this time, Olivia did not become an enemy so much as a fortress. She tightened public messaging and worked, with a clarity born of grief turned into duty, to shore up programs that might falter. Her public temper was measured. Her private world felt like a place where tenderness bled slowly into suspicion. She found Lily's navy scarf, once a symbol of safe continuity, in her office drawer, and traced the embroidered stars until she could name each one by a small memory. She told herself she had done what was necessary to protect the institution Marcus's memory had birthed. That was true and incomplete. On a rainy afternoon, Jackson received a letter, a call to appear before a board committee looking into collusion between staff and external agents. The language was sterile. The implication was not violent, but it was sharp. The bridge between private intent and public consequence had cracked. He thought of every time he had chosen to act quickly in the field and how those actions sometimes cost comfort afterward. He went to the meeting with the quiet steadiness of someone who had prepared for unromantic consequences. Lily, who listened to her father recount events at a distance, held onto a ritual that was not public. She embroidered a small star in the scarf every night and whispered it a story. The stars, for her, were names of people who had helped. they were also anchors. She hated the idea that adults could make dangerous choices even if the destination was right. The months that followed were a montage of hearings and reform plans. Harrington's legal counsel negotiated a plea that included restitution plans and cooperation. The city's media ran a spectrum of stories: heroic, cautionary, clinical. The foundation weathered measurable damage to donor confidence, but also gained a kind of sympathetic resilience from those who appreciated its prompt cooperation in the wake of revelation. What the legal victories could not heal immediately were the personal fissures. Olivia and Jackson avoided each other with the careful choreography of people trying not to touch a raw nerve. Lily began to retreat into small rituals, stacking blocks into telescopes, writing tiny lists in the back of her journal. The scarf lay folded at the bottom of a drawer for days. It was Lily, as ever, who mapped out the turning point. She was not a strategist. She was 7, and urgent in the way that children are about things that matter to them. She slipped a page from her journal into Olivia's office with the naivete of offering a thing as sacred. The entry was a small catalogue of observations. The man who taught her to stand like a soldier had a gentle voice. The man who taught her to do double unders had fingers that counted gently. The stars stitched in her scarf were like messages she sent to people who were lost. She wrote, "I think grown-ups forget sometimes, but notes fix things. I want to help fix." Olivia read Lily's lines and felt a less tempered anger dissolve into a more complicated grief. She had been operating under a binary, integrity versus transgression, but a child's journal refused binaries. It insisted that people carry contradictions. It insisted on mercy. When she saw Lily's drawing of 3 figures under stars, she realized the shape of what she had been protecting. Not the foundation as an abstraction, but the fragile network of real families that depended on it. Around this time, Martin called a private meeting. He had been reading the depositions and watching the prosecution build a case against Harrington. He said to Olivia, carefully, Jackson's testimony was pivotal. He spoke with clarity and with a candor that mattered for the record. A lot of this, holding people accountable, relies on testimony from the community. He suggested a path forward. Invite Jackson to participate in the redesigned oversight committee, not in a role of security, but as a community liaison. Someone who could speak for the families and for the practical needs the foundation sometimes had difficulty hearing. Olivia resisted. The memory of betrayal was still warm. Her public responsibilities made private reconciliation risky, but she also, quietly and without fanfare, considered Martin's point. She had watched the legal process, separate facts from rumor, and she had seen how Jackson, however imperfect his method, had helped point the audit toward necessary truths. She thought of Lily's small fingers stitching stars and of how children wrote truth without suspicion. She thought of Marcus and the original impulse. Leave something better than the loss. The gala, set months after the first whisper of the audit, was designed as both fundraiser and public reassurance. It was the kind of event that asked people to look at the future. Lights softened into gold. Donors wore neat faces. The stage was arranged like a promise. Olivia had planned the night with the meticulous care that had always been her method. She had invited Martin's proposed reforms to be presented. She had arranged for families to speak about what the foundation meant to them. She had not, however, expected to see Jackson on the guest list. On the night of the gala, the main ballroom smelled of roses and varnish. Photographers lined the fringes, and for a moment, the public glare threatened to make the room a stage for spectacle rather than healing. Olivia moved through the crowd with that controlled kindness she used when speaking with donors. She stepped to the podium and spoke about transparency and the obligation to families. Her words were the sort of measured thing that could close decent wounds. From the back of the room, a small commotion made her look up. Lily, who had been sitting with a volunteer, stood and walked forward with the slow, purposeful gait of a child who knows she is doing something important. Around her throat, the navy scarf gleamed under the warm lights, and something had been added to it. A delicate embroidery of tiny silver stars that caught the chandeliers and held them like constellations. Lily climbed the stage with the confidence of someone who had practiced bravery in a gym's back room. She put the scarf around Olivia's neck with both hands and looked directly at her as if reading a map. Olivia felt the scarf's texture and the weight of the small stars. There was a rustle in the hall, like a drawing in a quiet cathedral. "Miss Bennet," Lily said, with the earnest diction of a child who had rehearsed honesty, "this is for you, for the people you help, for the stars." Olivia felt, in that moment, the public and private collide in a way that did not yield to headlines. She looked out and saw Jackson, standing at the fringe of the crowd, watching not for applause, but for the small verification that something human might be repaired. He had come because Lily had asked him to. He had bought the ticket with the economy of someone who knew the cost of absence. After the presentation, amidst polite clapping, Jackson approached the stage. The room, for a breath, seemed to contain a different possibility. Instead of hands that reached to reclaim a narrative, they were hands that reached to stitch it. He handed Olivia an envelope. Inside, a completed scholarship for a family who had been on wait lists. The gesture tested the rules they had both been living under. The institutional and the human had to touch. They talked in the quiet backstage area where staffers kept bouquets and bottles. Olivia's first words were not forgiving. They rarely began that way. They were practical, a rehearsal of the professional. "We have to make sure procedures don't allow this to happen again." Jackson didn't argue. He said, with a reserve as exact as any formation he'd once held, "I know." He added, after a beat, "I'm sorry for how I did it." Apologies, in their small sincerity, do not fix everything, but they move things. Olivia listened and, like a person who had learned to measure risk, measured the difference between words and actions. After the gala, in a smaller meeting that included Martin and a newly formed oversight committee, she agreed to a role for Jackson, community liaison to the program that would integrate family services into the foundation's offerings. It was not a full return to the fold. It was an invitation to rebuild in public. The handshake that followed, shaped by protocol, softened into a hand that stayed a second longer than formality required. It eased into a touch that could be called more than agreement, the ghost of a different kind of trust. Cameras at the edges of the room found applause and framed the scene as a resolution. The man who had once shielded a child in a mall now stood as a public partner in repair. The city, always hungry for tidy endings, began to talk not only about scandal, but about restitution and new programs. Over the next months, the foundation announced reforms, clearer accounting practices, an independent oversight board, and the new family-focused program Jackson had proposed in the gym. The program combined weekend classes, counseling services, and a small fund for emergency needs. It was, in its modesty, the kind of architecture that could prevent some of the harms that had occurred. The city media, which had once circled for scandal, began to run profiles about the families who had regained footing, and the volunteers who had stepped forward. Lily's role never diminished. She became, in a way that required no permission, the public face of small healing. At the program's ribbon cutting, she stood on a little stool, scarf around her neck, and read a sentence from her journal into a microphone with a seriousness that made the room hush. "Stars help us remember," she read. "They remind us to be kind and to fix things when they break." The crowd clapped like someone exhaling. Months later, one afternoon when the program had a modest roster and the office felt steady, Olivia found a small envelope tucked into her desk drawer. Inside was a note from Jackson. No long explanations, no legal argument, just a line. "Thank you for letting us try again." It was a small diplomatic act, the kind that repaired interiors rather than files. Olivia looked at the note, and then at the scarf draped over a chair, its stars catching the afternoon light that pooled through the window. They were not a family because a headline said so. They were a family because of the small things. A kettle on when someone worked late, Lily learning to tie a tie for a school assembly, a scholarship that fed hungry kids on Saturdays. Trust rebuilt in increments. It grew where obligations were met and where apologies were shaped into concrete acts. Testimony that pursued accountability, a scholarship that filled a need, a program that welcomed families back. The final public scene that stitched their private narrative together came with the program's first-year celebration. The hall was small, with paper lanterns and folding chairs, but the feeling in it was large. Families who had once stood on waitlists now sat in front rows. Martin read a short statement about reforms and prosecutions closed with appropriate legal finality. Harrington had been found culpable by evidence and was ordered to repay a portion of funds, a process that would not erase harm but would hold someone legally accountable. He was a cautionary figure in a story that Olivia had always hoped would be about repair rather than retribution. On stage, Lily held Olivia's hand and Jackson's other hand. The gesture was not ostentatious. It was simply the small physical vocabulary of people who had learned to touch without fear. Olivia looked at the two of them and felt something settle that had been raw for months. The city still spoke about the scandal in opinion columns and podcasts, but their table, this small circle, had its own quieter commentary of salted laughter and early morning pancakes. The navy scarf,